The year was 1324. The endless sands of the Sahara Desert were witnessing the most magnificent and destructive caravan history had ever seen. This was not merely a religious pilgrimage. It was a massive transfer of wealth that would shake the foundations of the world economy. At the head of the caravan was Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, who possessed a fortune that no human living today has ever reached. According to modern economists, this man, with a fortune of more than $400 billion in today's money, held almost half of the world's gold reserves at that time. However, his story is not just about glittering jewels. It is the first great lesson in history of how excessive wealth can turn into an economic weapon and how an uncontrolled money supply can bring a civilization to its knees. Mansa Musa reached Cairo with 60,000 men and 80 camels, each carrying bars of pure gold. Musa wanted to be known for his generosity, and as he entered the city, he began to hand out handfuls of gold to the poor, mosques, and government officials. The streets of Cairo were suddenly flooded with gold. People thought it was a divine blessing. But there was one thing they did not know. This massive and uncontrolled amount of gold entering the market would ruthlessly trigger the most fundamental rule of economics. In the financial world, we call this the disruption of the balance of supply and demand. If the quantity of a commodity increases excessively in the market, the value of that commodity inevitably falls. Mansa Musa had distributed so much gold that gold had become as common as an ordinary stone in Cairo. This situation destroyed the purchasing power of the local currency overnight. Even to buy a single loaf of bread, a handful of gold was now required. While Mansa Musa wanted to do good, he dragged the regional economy into a dark hyperinflation crisis that would last for 10 years. There is no difference between modern central banks printing uncontrolled cash today and Mansa Musa dumping gold into the streets of Cairo 700 years ago. Economics is not about money, but about the production and trust behind that money. When Mansa Musa left the city, he left behind not a wealthy people, but a wreckage where prices skyrocketed and trade came to a standstill. The gold he distributed had become a curse, not a fortune. For the people of Cairo, how could an emperor fix an economy he had broken with his own hands? When Mansa Musa realized his mistake, he would have to carry out the first and largest buyback operation in history. But this move would change not only the fate of Egypt, but also the fate of his own empire forever. He began borrowing back his own gold at high interest rates from the very merchants he had enriched. This was a desperate attempt to reduce the money supply and stabilize the value of gold once again. The markets were in chaos, as the sudden influx of wealth vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Merchants who had once celebrated their new wealth now faced a devalued currency and a volatile market. Mansa Musa's journey had inadvertently created a laboratory for economic theory centuries before the field even existed. It proved that gold, despite its shine, is only as valuable as its scarcity. If gold is everywhere, it is worth nothing. This paradox would follow Mansa Musa all the way to Mecca and back to his homeland. The unintended consequences of his charity would ripple through the Mediterranean and even reach the ears of European monarchs, who began to depict him on maps holding a golden nugget. The world now viewed Mali as a land of infinite riches, but back in Cairo, the struggle for survival continued. The inflation had wiped out the savings of the middle class, leaving a gap between the elite and the impoverished. This historical event serves as a stark warning to modern financial systems about the dangers of rapid monetary expansion without underlying economic growth. Mansa Musa was a king of kings, but even he was subject to the laws of mathematics and market psychology. As he moved toward the holy city, the shadow of his wealth loomed larger than his empire itself. The lessons learned in the streets of Cairo would eventually lay the groundwork for understanding monetary policy in the centuries to follow. Traders began to realize that currency stability was far more important than a sudden windfall of precious metals. The gold that had been a symbol of Mali's power had become a testament to its potential for disruption. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was a spectacle of faith, but it became a milestone in the history of finance. The echoes of those camel bells and the clinking of gold bars still resonate in the halls of modern banks and treasury departments. As we conclude this first chapter, we see an emperor who realized that true power is not in giving gold, but in controlling its flow. The next stage of his journey would require more than just generosity. It would require strategic financial manipulation to save his reputation and the regional economy. The gold was out of the bag, and the world was watching to see if the richest man in history could survive the very wealth he created. The stage was set for a dramatic return journey, one that would test the limits of his influence and the resilience of his people. This was the beginning of the end of a golden era, and the start of a new understanding of value itself. Mansa Musa had completed his pilgrimage to Mecca, fulfilling his spiritual duty. But as he turned his caravan back toward Egypt, he was met with a grim reality. The very gold he had distributed as a gesture of divine grace had become a poison that paralyzed the markets of the Middle East. News reached him that the value of gold had hit an all-time low, and the cost of living for the common people had become unbearable. The generous king of Mali was no longer seen only as a benefactor, but as the architect of an economic catastrophe. In Cairo, the local currency was so devalued that merchants refused to trade, and the basic necessities of life had become luxury items. Musa realized that his legendary generosity had inadvertently created a vacuum of value that only he could fill. He was no longer just a pilgrim. He had to become the world's first individual central banker to prevent a total regional collapse. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Mansa Musa initiated a desperate and unprecedented financial maneuver. He decided to borrow back the very gold he had given away. But the market was now a different beast. The merchants and moneylenders of Cairo, sensing his desperation and the scarcity they could create, began to charge exorbitant interest rates. This was the first recorded instance of a large-scale buyback strategy, designed to remove excess currency from circulation and restore its value. Musa's agents flooded the markets, not with gifts this time, but with high-interest loan agreements that sucked the gold back into the royal coffers. Every bar of gold, he reclaimed, was a step toward stabilizing the broken economy of Egypt. This tight monetary policy was a brutal necessity, turning the once beloved emperor into a man of cold, hard business. The impact of this operation was immediate and volatile, sending shockwaves through the Mediterranean trade routes. As Musa's caravan began its long journey home, the gold supply in Cairo suddenly tightened, causing the price of gold to skyrocket once again. The economy shifted from a state of hyperinflation to a state of sharp deflation in a matter of months. This erratic fluctuation made it impossible for local businesses to plan for the future, leading to a decade-long period of economic instability. Musa had effectively manipulated the global price of gold, twice in a single journey. First, by flooding it, and then by hoarding it. He had learned the hard way that wealth is not just about how much you have, but about how you control the velocity of its movement. His entourage, once a symbol of endless bounty, was now a heavily guarded fortress of reclaimed debt. As the caravan moved deeper into the desert, Musa faced a new crisis. The sheer cost of his own stabilization plan. Borrowing gold at such high interest rates had placed a massive financial burden on the Mali Empire's future. He was returning to his homeland not just with new knowledge and scholars, but with a mountain of debt that needed to be serviced. The journey home was a logistical nightmare, with thousands of his followers suffering from the harsh conditions of the Sahara. Even the richest man in history found that nature does not care for the weight of your gold when water is scarce. Musa's survival during this return trip was a testament to his resilience. But the man who entered Mali was different from the one who had left. He had witnessed the destructive power of his own fortune and the fragility of the world as financial systems. Back in the capital of Niani, Musa began to implement a new vision for his empire based on his experiences in the East. He understood that Mali's true power should not rely solely on the export of raw gold, which could be devalued by a single shopping spree. He started investing heavily in human capital, bringing back architects, poets, and jurists from the Islamic world to build a sustainable civilization. The gold that remained was channeled into building universities and libraries, turning cities like Timbuktu into global centers of learning. This was a strategic shift from a resource-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, a move far ahead of its time. He wanted Mali to be remembered not for the gold it gave away, but for the wisdom it cultivated within its borders. Yet, the legends of his pilgrimage had already spread far and wide, reaching the maps of European kings who now looked toward Africa with greedy eyes. The unintended consequence of his fame was that he had placed a giant target on the Mali Empire. By showing the world exactly where the gold came from, he had invited future generations of explorers and exploiters to his doorstep. The economic ripples of his trip reached as far as Italy and Spain, where bankers began to adjust their gold to silver ratios based on the Malian shock. Musa had effectively integrated West Africa into the global financial grid, but at the cost of its anonymity and long-term security. He spent the rest of his reign trying to manage this newfound prestige while keeping the empire-less borders secure. The mosques he built every Friday were symbols of his faith, but the universities he built were his attempt to outlast the volatility of the gold market. As we look at the legacy of his buyback today, we see the echoes of modern quantitative tightening and interest rate hikes. Mansa Musa was a pioneer who navigated the treacherous waters of macroeconomics without a map or a textbook. He proved that even an absolute monarch is subject to the invisible hand of the market. His story serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of rapid monetary expansion and the difficulty of reversing its effects. The gold had been a tool of diplomacy, a symbol of devotion, and a weapon of economic ruin, all at once. In the end, Musa's greatest achievement was not the wealth he possessed, but the realization that gold is only a shadow of true value. This second chapter ends with an empire at its peak, yet standing on the precipice of a world that now knew its secrets, forever changing the relationship between money, power, and perception. Mansa Musa returned to the Mali Empire not just as a king, but as a visionary who had witnessed the fragility of a resource-dependent economy. He realized that for Mali to survive the test of time, it needed more than just gold mines. It needed an intellectual infrastructure that could command respect across the globe. He began a massive transformation of the city of Timbuktu, investing his remaining wealth into the construction of the Jingerber Mosque and the University of St. This was perhaps the first historical example of a sovereign wealth fund being used to pivot a nation from a commodity-based economy to a knowledge-based one. By attracting the greatest scholars, astronomers, and architects from across the Islamic world, Musa turned his capital into a global hub of innovation. He understood that while gold could be devalued by inflation, knowledge was a currency that only appreciated over time. Timbuktu became a medieval Silicon Valley, where the most valuable trade goods were no longer salt or gold, but books and manuscripts. This strategic shift in investment paid off as Mali entered a golden age of intellectual and cultural dominance. For decades, the empire was the center of the world's scholarly attention, and its libraries housed thousands of unique manuscripts covering everything from mathematics to human rights. However, the sheer fame of Musa's pilgrimage had permanently altered the world's perception of Africa. In Europe, the 1375 Catalan Atlas depicted Mansa Musa sitting on a throne, holding a massive golden nugget, which acted as a beacon for future European explorers. The visibility that Musa had sought as a point of pride eventually became a curse for his successors. The world now knew exactly where the source of the world's gold was located, and the age of exploration was quietly morphing into an age of exploitation. Mali's openness and wealth had inadvertently invited the very forces that would eventually lead to the fragmentation of the region. The decline of the Mali Empire after Musa's death serves as a stark reminder of the resource curse, a phenomenon modern economists still study today. When a nation relies too heavily on a single valuable resource, it often fails to develop other sectors of its economy, leading to a brittle structure. As the gold mines began to deplete and trade routes shifted, the empire struggled to maintain its expensive intellectual and military apparatus. The successes of Musa could not replicate his unique blend of charisma and financial strategic thinking. Civil wars broke out, and neighboring kingdoms began to chip away at the edges of the once mighty empire. The gold that had once built universities was now being spent on endless internal conflicts. By the time the colonial era arrived, the memory of the world's richest man had faded into the realm of myth and legend. Yet, the legacy of Mansa Musa remains one of the most important chapters in the history of global finance and macroeconomics. He was a man who single-handedly manipulated the world's currency markets centuries before the existence of Wall Street or the International Monetary Fund. His story proves that even the most absolute power is subject to the cold, hard laws of supply and demand. Modern investors still look to the Mansa Musa shock as a case study in what happens when a sudden influx of capital hits an unprepared market. He remains a symbol of both the pinnacle of human achievement and the dangerous volatility of unchecked wealth. His transition from a gold-obsessed monarch to a patron of science shows a sophisticated understanding of soft power that many modern leaders still struggle to grasp. Timbuktu stands today as a dusty testament to a time when Africa was the world's premier destination for both wealth and wisdom. In our modern world of digital currencies and complex stock markets, the lessons of the 14th century are more relevant than ever. We see the same patterns of inflation, the same bubbles of speculation, and the same desperate attempts by governments to stabilize failing economies. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was a spectacle of faith, but its true impact was the creation of a global economic awareness. He forced the world to realize that we are all connected by the threads of trade and the value we assign to our currencies. As we look back at the Golden King, we see a mirror of our own financial struggles and aspirations. The gold may be gone, but the economic principles he accidentally discovered continue to govern our lives every single day. The story of the richest man in history is not just a tale of the past. It is a roadmap for our financial future. The silence of the Sahara now covers much of what Musa built, but the spirit of his ambition remains unburied. Every time a central bank raises rates or an investor fears a market bubble, they are living in the world Mansa Musa helped to define. He was a man who proved that gold is a heavy burden, and true legacy is built on what you teach, not what you spend. Mali's golden age may have set with the sun, but the financial light it casts still illuminates the path for those who seek to understand the true nature of value. The wealth of Musa was a moment in time, but the lesson of his life is eternal. Riches without wisdom is merely a glittering path to ruin. As we conclude this saga, we are left with the image of a king who had everything, yet realized that the most precious asset on earth is the human mind. His pilgrimage ended in Mecca, but his economic journey continues in every transaction we make in the modern world.